Hi, and welcome to this video tutorial. My name's Ron Vellon, and I'm happy to be able to have this conversation with you about resistance to change. This is a topic that gets a lot of mileage, I think because we encounter it so often. We encounter it on a small scale, just in our own lives with things we want to change for ourselves. We encounter it in our families, with our friendships, and certainly we encounter it on a daily basis whenever we're leading any kind of a change effort in an organizational setting. So it's important to understand that at the root of pretty much any resistance is something that we talk about at different times when you're leading change. And that is that anyone we're working with when we're leading a change effort or even participating in one is constantly looking for an answer to the question WIIFM. Now, what this means in its direct sense from the acronym is what's in it for me, which sounds selfish, but really what the question is asking is, do I see how this is going to benefit the organization? Do I see my role in it? It's not just about me personally, but also how I view the world around me that this potential change effort is going to impact. And so a lot of times we overlook this and we tend to go very quickly into a change effort and build off the initial momentum. And as we learned from studying the kind of classic change curve, that momentum is very energy producing and it's very enlivening, but we ultimately crash because people will start to resist and we may not even see it coming. So the point to all this is when we look at the resistances and understanding both the causes and the symptoms, so what's really underneath the resistance that we see and how do we see it showing up, is that the resistance is a form of energy that if we tap into, we can learn something from and also have a potential to engage the people who are resisting in the change effort in a way that fits well with them. And that produces great energy and commitment over the long run. So let's begin with our initial conversation about working with and understanding resistance to change. To begin, let's look at, let's call it a definition of what resistance to change is. We know from experience that resistance to change may be the reason for the failure of an attempted change, but the reality behind it is more complex for sure. Sometimes it's how the change is being managed that will aggravate and bring out even more resistance than we anticipated. This I've seen, and maybe you have seen as well, many, many times. We think the messaging is very clear going out, but really we're masking things, or we're not being completely honest, or we're not inviting the dialogue and participation in a sincere and complete way. So people will resist. And so that to me is normal and is not the fault of the people resisting. Sometimes the change is welcomed because it's seen as having benefits, but even when it's welcomed, how the change is implemented may see resistance as well. I've had experiences where things have moved really, really well, and you handle and work with the various things that come up along the way when people express resistance or questions. And questions are not the same as resistance. Questions are often legitimate ways for people to understand so that we can be proactive, and instead of getting resistance, we'll get engagement, which is terrific. We need to understand that we, as leaders of change, have sometimes the tendency to blame the people resisting. And what do I mean by blame? I'll give you an example of something that happened to me a few years ago. So we were going to implement something in a larger organization, and one person said, well, we should start with the whole organization at once because without those approvals, implementing the change in a smaller way may not be as beneficial. And in my mind, I thought the best way to start is to begin with an implementation with a part of the organization that's keen on it, test it, and if it works well, it might be a lot easier to get the approval of the whole organization. Now, I was the one in a more leadership role in this case, but the person had quite a bit of experience and a strong network. And when we were having this conversation, it seemed pleasant, but I had a feeling something bothered her. And later on, when I wanted to contact her and talk about it, she never returned my phone calls. In other words, she dropped out and became difficult to connect with. Is it entirely her fault? No. Did I feel at the time it was? Yes. But that's my own misunderstanding of the situation. And eventually, we were able to move things along, but it comes up because In the moment where we have our hearts set and moving things along a certain way, we might be very attached to our way of doing it or our view of the world. And so the old motto about going slow to go fast really comes up over and over again. Whatever it was, we weren't able to really ever have that conversation, unfortunately. Now, that's not ideal, and it's not something that happens all the time, but these things do happen. But instead of blaming her for the resistance, what's better is to look at it and say, what's going on that we can possibly resolve here and see if there's a way to work it out. So that's what you ideally want to do. So leaders, don't blame the people resisting. Find out about it and open up the dialogue. Not for the sake of manipulating the situation, although I know we do want to get our projects, moving forward, but to really understand, what's the blind spot here? What are they trying to communicate? And we may find that if we handle it with diligence and consideration and really valuing what we're hearing, we might find a way to turn it into something even better than we imagined. So let's look now at some of the main causes of resistance. Now, we're talking about organizational resistance here. So these are the causes we see in organizations. It will overlap and connect with individual motivations for resistance in our day-to-day lives, but we're really focusing on the context of an organizational setting. And there's quite a few here, so we're going to focus on the ones that are bolded in green, and the other ones will be hopefully fairly straightforward that you can integrate later. So the first one could be a low tolerance for uncertainty. Now, this could be the organizational experience, or it could be the culture, something in the culture that makes it perhaps averse to any kind of uncertainty or risk. Maybe they've gone through some kind of process recently and people are kind of tired. There could be a lot of reasons for the tolerance for uncertainty. Maybe people have lost jobs. This is certainly pronounced if there's been a layoff or, at the time of doing this video, we're going through COVID-19 and there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty just out in the ethers, let alone within any specific organization where it's probably magnified. So low tolerance for uncertainty collectively will produce a lot of resistance. The perceived negative effects on the interests of the people involved. So this is the WIIFM piece that I was mentioning earlier. Do people see the upside for themselves? And again, I don't believe this is selfish. I mean, organizations are run by people, at least they are so far, and people have a right to know how these things impact them. So if there's a perception that's different than what the change is actually going to produce, then that needs to be corrected for sure, and people need to be able to trust that. If there are going to be negative effects for whatever reason, organizations moving, reorganizing, people are being laid off, parts of a business may be closing, or many other reasons, then we also need to be honest. One thing I found in my experience, which may be one of the most difficult things to do, is to attempt to lead a change effort that is about moving the organization forward while what we might perceive as negative changes are taking place. In other words, people are being laid off or there are reductions at the same time. This is a very tough thing to combine, and yet sometimes organizations are faced with that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the communication around this tends to be too buttoned down. People are afraid to be really honest, and then what happens is people don't trust the people communicating to them, which is often senior leadership, and it causes all kinds of other problems. The perceived breach of the psychological contract. So what is the psychological contract? This is something that is not written. This is the implied or experienced exchange that takes place between the organization and you as the employee. So if you are employed there, the psychological contract might involve some level of job security or opportunities for advancement or development and growth. It's about the relationship between you and the organization. What do they expect from you? What do you expect from them? And so often these things aren't really spelled out, but the psychological contract is very easily breached since it's not something that's written down typically. And it's really a collection of perceptions and expectations. So we have to be very careful when we are leading change and understand what are the expectations of the people that are being affected by the change. What are their perceptions? We can ask and have dialogue with people that we work with and say, what is it you expect from us? What do you think our expectations are of you? And maybe kind of build bridges around that and understand it, because maybe you've worked in a place that seemed to have a lot of job security and people are making arbitrary decisions. And it seems like, well, they're giving us job security, but they're not treating us very well because they're giving it to us. That happens in places sometimes. But that's all part of different perceptions of what that psychological contract is. So if we breach it, there's going to be trouble. Lack of clarity as to what's expected. You can never be too clear when we're leading a change effort. Especially if there's a lot of people involved, we put out memos and emails, and we have, even video presentations of things. And we think we're communicating really well, and we probably are putting a lot of effort into it. But I can tell you, even a meeting I was in not long ago where we had senior leadership, part of the meeting was prepared answers to questions nobody really had, but it made it sort of a whitewash over some of the more important questions that we did have that did not get answered in this meeting. So we're left with the same frustrations we had before, and they may think they did address those questions. So it's a very strange thing. Really double check that really the people are clear about what's going on and that you're clear about what they're telling you. Too much change. And this kind of goes back to a little bit connected to the low tolerance for uncertainty. It's not the same, but it may be part of the same issue, that maybe there's too many things going on, that, maybe there's so many changes or projects, just a lot's going on that is taxing people's attention and energy. If there's a lot of change going out, people will run out of what we call capacity. That's a term we use in the organization change field. What is our energy resource available to us to be able to handle all of the changes that are taking place? Sometimes it's just enough is enough. Maybe you've gone through this in your own personal life. I've certainly met many people, and I've been one of them at different times, where I've moved cities, changed jobs, had to find a place to live, even finding a place to get a haircut or getting a new dentist, if you move to a new city. All of these things weigh on people. And so if we throw more and more stuff at people going through a lot of stuff in their work lives, in the organization, they're going to max out. And then you're going to have burnout and all other issues, and certainly you'll see resistance. Cumulative effect of other life changes. This is a thing I just mentioned. So if people are going through things in their own personal lives, again, as I mentioned, this video is being recorded during COVID-19. And while this pandemic is going on, there are people dealing with things in all kinds of ways we may not be aware of. Even if their work life has not been dramatically altered, there's still the stress of working with people who are going through their own stresses, our own stresses at home. All these things go on in the background of our awareness, and they take our attention and our energy and motivation. And the last one that we're going to look at is the legacy of past changes. What's been the history of the things that have taken place within the organization we're in? Has it been a lot of promising and under-delivering? Have there been a lot of statements made about how great something's going to be, and it ends up costing people time, energy, and, has been a big letdown? Whatever that legacy is, that history is going to lead to perception of what's coming. So I have certainly worked in some places, and maybe you have as well, where I think I've even used these words, we want to make things better than perhaps you've experienced in the past. Whatever the history is, it's going to help create a perception. So this is really about building trust. So if there's a legacy that is working against you, you're going to have to take baby steps to build trust. You're going to just find that people will not buy into it unless they trust you. And then you have to follow through. It doesn't mean your change effort's going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that everything you do is going to pay off in exactly the way you said, but you have to continually communicate and listen all the way through. If there's one commonality with the ones we've discussed here in this video, and there's others here that are more straightforward, it's this. Take your time, don't overpromise, and listen an awful lot, and give people the opportunity to articulate their concerns and their resistances. And that alone We'll start to build trust. We'll start to build momentum over time. And you may get away with it with a small project that you lead. Maybe it's a small change you're implementing in a department that you didn't really talk to people and you implement it. But be careful, because that win that you think went so well, we file these things. I heard this explanation once that the resentments we build up are like driftwood that float up on the beach of our mind. And then one day we just lose it and say, look at all this driftwood. It's cluttering up my beach. That's a big expression of resistance. That's saying I've had enough. So be sure you take your time, even with small things. Check things out with people. You have to be sincere when you do it, or people will smell a rat and just not want to follow through. And then we're going to take a look now at some of the actual symptoms of resistance, how these causes actually show up. And you're going to see that if we don't pay attention to the causes, we're going to have to deal with a lot of these symptoms. So let's take a look at those now. So here we are with the active symptoms of resistance, and there are active ones and passive ones. The active ones I find are easier to deal with because you can see them, you can address them, they're visible. The passive ones are trickier because you don't see them necessarily. It's kind of like if you've ever heard the expression passive aggressive, it's not that someone's being obvious with their actions, and often we can find the passive ones out, too late. But let's focus on the active ones now. And they're very simple. I'm going to go through them very briefly, just so you understand what they are, but they should be pretty straightforward. Being critical, this is someone who's really just critiquing something. It doesn't necessarily have to be harsh, but just being critical, and you'll hear it verbally or in writing. Finding fault is like being critical. It's similar to that. It's the person who pokes holes in everything you're doing. I actually don't mind this. When someone does this, I actually appreciate it. It's kind of like that old thing. I spent quite a bit of time working in sales and marketing years ago, and I always found that the difficulty is when you had silence. But if somebody raised an objection, to me, that's energy you can work with. And so I don't mind finding fault or being critical. That tells me something. There's energy, and the person needs to be heard about something important. Ridiculing, this is like finding fault. It's the same thing. As long as it's not a personal attack, which becomes more challenging. If they're ridiculing something, that's again a conversation to have. And if someone's being very critical in a meeting, I certainly give voice to that in meetings, and we can flesh it out. But if it becomes more of a personal thing, if it becomes more like personal ridiculing against, let's say, me, if I'm the change leader, I'll definitely want to talk to the person in private and really hear them out and see what their main concern is and see what we can do about it. Arguing, of course, this is when the being critical or finding fault becomes more combative. We have to be careful here. If we're engaging in this, leaders are responsible for toning down that argument. So if it becomes argumentative, that means these other things have become, shall we say, they've gotten off the rails. Appealing to fear. This is, to me, is a form of critique. So it's the what if scenario. If someone is raising a fear, then we have to flesh out those fears and give people voice to them. Don't rush to solve a fear, because you won't be able to unless you actually have a fact that counteracts the fear. Sometimes people just want to know that you acknowledge the fear, and sometimes can just be very happy knowing that the fear is on the table and is being considered. Starting rumors. This happens when there's little or no information. We don't like a vacuum. Much like nature abhors a vacuum, people abhor vacuums too. Meaning, if we don't have information, we start filling in the blanks. I've seen this happen over and over and over again. One of the things you can do is try to tap into informal networks and so on where these rumor mills are, and see if you can bring them to the table and talk about what rumors are based on. Sometimes rumors are based on part facts, so they may not be way off base. Distorting facts. This happens to people that are sometimes involved with things and they don't like it, so they go out and spread false facts, if you will. This is the same like starting rumors. Blaming or accusing. This is again an aggressive form of assigning blame and connects to some of the others. When it becomes threatening or manipulation or sabotage or blocking and undermining, these are more serious. And these require, direct dialogue. All I can say is to cluster all these together simply that if you're starting to see intimidation or actual threats, which are rare, but they could occur. Sometimes a threat is, I want it done this way, you're not going to get my support. That's when sometimes we have to bring on other parties in to see what can be done to handle this. Manipulation, I always find manipulation is more obvious than people realize. Sabotaging or blocking or undermining, these are very difficult things to deal with. These things can be somewhat avoided, not always, but they can be avoided if we pay attention early on. So early on when we're managing our change process is to really kind of sniff some of these things out and listen. And you may find before it gets off the rails that there's some things you can do with smaller resistances that show up earlier. Again, you may not be able to, but these are difficult things to handle that require certainly some direct action because otherwise things will fall apart. So these are a good example of across the board active symptoms of resistance that are fairly commonplace. Let's take a look now at the passive symptoms. So we have a handful here of passive systems of resistance. Some of these will look and feel a lot like passive aggression, but we're not here to fully flesh out all the psychology behind it. But here are some that you will probably have experienced at some point. First one, agreeing verbally, but not following through. The malicious compliance. This is just, yes, I'll do it. But this is, the classic kind of dragging our feet. There's an expression here I think is worthwhile to note, and that is, and this comes from the change world, that people vote with their feet. What does this actually mean? People don't literally vote with their feet, but what it means is that people will say a lot of things, but people will do what they feel is most right for them at any time. Their actions will tell you more about what's going on if you notice their inconsistencies of what they're saying. Failing to implement the change. So this is a pretty clear one. If someone's not doing their part or their department's not implementing a particular change, there's a reason. And actually, I don't find this so passive. I find this pretty clear. But what is the reason? There has to be something going on. And if they're not implementing it at all, they were probably not heard early on, or maybe they weren't asked. But if there's a reason, find out what it is, and it's going to take time, but it has to be done. Procrastinating. Okay, this is similar to this one. It's the same as agreeing and not following through. Feigning ignorance. This, I didn't know I was supposed to do this. This is where the follow-up from agreements needs to happen. It's usually they're trying to hide something. Maybe they don't feel comfortable telling you what the real reason is. Withholding information. This is like dragging our feet. Withholding information, suggestions, help, or support. Watch for silence. If someone is withholding, this is what we consider more passive-aggressive kind of behavior. Find out why, what is going on, and don't always believe the first reason, because they might say, I didn't know I was supposed to, blah, blah, blah. Again, you're probably picking up on a pattern here that so much of this is dialogue-driven. We have to really pay attention to what is going on for people through the change process that we're leading. And then standing by and allowing change to fail. This is the same as, procrastinating or not implementing at all. If someone is a bystander like that and they're not speaking up, it's unfortunately too late. If the change effort fails because someone did not step in and help out, then we have to find out why. If this was a senior manager, like someone was your boss or someone who had supposedly sponsored the initiative, this happened to me once where I was asked to design or revamp a performance management system, and the senior managers that wanted it were never around to support it. So that became very, very difficult. It's not that they wanted the change to fail, but they didn't realize that without their support, it would fail. So don't assume intent with any of these, because if you assume intent, that's the same as blame. So find out what's going on. And most of the time, you're going to find that people will be open as long as you provide that opportunity and they can trust you. These things can be handled, and hopefully proactively. At this point, as we near the end of our discussion about resistance, it's important to mention that managers can also be resistors, and often our colleagues or the more senior people will have their own versions of the causes we've discussed earlier, and they will show up as similar symptoms. You would hope it would be less so depending on what the change is, assuming people would all be supportive of it. But the reality is managers, like non-management employees, are human beings as well, and they have their own needs and drivers, motivations. And so it's important to understand that we need to pay attention to the management roles that are implicated in the change that we are leading. And the same guidance applies, get folks engaged, go slow to go fast, and make sure that we understand that just because someone is in a management or leadership role, that they're not all the same. Even though sometimes they may put forth the same kind of language, yes, we agree, this kind of thing, it's not unusual for management to be perhaps even some of the biggest resistors. So make sure you understand when we talk about management, I'm talking specifically about those in the middle roles that are there to translate and put forward policy and decision making from more senior levels with their often frontline employees. They may feel uncomfortable in that role if they don't agree with the change, and they may not be telling you the things that some of their employees might be telling you. And so the wide open dialogue idea is really important here. And so make sure you understand that they are critical role players. You need to see the managers that report to you, who are in lower levels perhaps, as implicated and as impacted as if they were frontline employees in many cases, because they have to manage and deal with all the things that need to be changed depending on what you're doing. So without getting too wordy, I just want to say pay attention to the management roles involved as much as you pay attention to the employee roles, the non-management employee roles that are also included or involved in the change effort that you're leading. And now in this final part, we're going to look at what do you do when you are encountering resistance when you're leading a change effort. Ideally, if you do everything as well as possible and you've got everyone engaged, you're not going to encounter as much of it. However, you will inevitably encounter resistance. So what do you do? Sometimes it's a matter of letting nature take its course. In other words, just let things unfold. Sometimes people will go through various denials and resistances and explorations and ultimately may come back to a level of commitment on their own. I'm not as much a fan of this, if at all possible, because I have not seen it resolve itself perfectly necessarily. If it's just left on its own, it can leave a lot of resentments on the table, which can come back to bite you later. That's this one here. Action strategies. So this is based on the idea that resistance is some connection or attachment or attraction to the way things are now. So there are things that can be done to make the new situation more attractive, to over time show and convince the folks that are being impacted by the change that the newness will be beneficial. And there are a number of things that can be done. A lot of it is communication, but as we've been talking about earlier, a lot of it is around trust. Even if they really trust, there may be other issues that come up that, we trust the people leading the change, but maybe we don't trust what happens when the change effort is over and we have to live with this. There's a lot of things that can come up. So it's either a laissez-faire, let nature take its course, or take some action. In the action side, there are some contingency approaches that we can take with this. So let's have a look at those now. So when it comes to taking action, we have to think in contingency ways. In other words, as the circumstances evolve and change or require special attention, there are different things that we can do. Some are more highly recommended than others, certainly, as you'll see. So John Cotter and a partner Sussinger identified these 6 strategies. First thing first, education, keeping people informed and being real about it. I cannot emphasize this enough. There may be things that are confidential that you can't share, granted, but often we can overestimate what we need to keep confidential and then people become suspicious. So education is being clear about what the challenges are, what the benefits are, why things are being done the way they're being done. Always answering the why question as clearly as possible. And please don't come up with some line or some phrasing that sounds good, but it really isn't really answering the question. This happens quite a bit. Sometimes there's a lot of fear by the people leading the change that if we told them the truth, something bad would happen. It's a judgment call, but I always believe in being as open as possible, and you'll find that people will trust more. Participation, getting folks involved as soon as possible and as legitimately as possible. Make sure that the involvement is not a quick chit chat and thanks for the ideas, or you interview 1,000 people and you take a summary and people don't really feel heard. Real participation. Facilitation. This is about providing the technical and emotional resources for people to move through the change. We're not talking about facilitating necessarily a dialogue. That would probably come up in the participation side, but this is ensuring that people have the resources and support they need to move through the change. And sometimes what organizations will do is load up heavily on the expectation or the change that's expected and throw a few supports out there and say, look what we're spending on support. But the change itself is not necessarily being handled well, or the questions aren't being answered well. So the support's going to be, not really appreciated for what it is, because maybe it's inadequate or not really answering the questions that are really out there. Negotiation. This is do this and we'll give you this. This is the kind of thing where we're offering incentives for people to hopefully lower their resistances. And this can come in many forms. Maybe there are going to be new opportunities. Maybe there are going to be some other benefits that are offered to people if they go along with it for whatever reason. It could be financial, could be other things. Then we get into the really nasty stuff, which will blow up, but does sometimes happen. The pair of manipulation and coercion. So this selective use of information, this occurs too often where it's not outright manipulation. Often it's based in fear, where the leaders of the change effort or the organization are afraid that if they say too much, things will blow up. So they say things that are sort of couched in certain language, as I was saying earlier, that can come across as a bit suspicious. People are smart. They can smell things when they don't seem to be right. And so manipulation will be sometimes assumed, and really sometimes it's just fear that's being masked. And the last one is coercion. It's astounding to me sometimes how people will get frustrated because things aren't happening. Maybe they're not coming to meetings or they're not following through. So we get frustrated. And sometimes leadership will say, we have to do this or you risk your job. Now you've hit a wall. If you're actually using coercion, it better be the last resort, because it may be the last resort. In other words, if you use any kind of coercion or a threat and you don't follow through, not only will you not be appreciated, to say the least, because you did threaten people with some kind of an action, but if you don't follow through, then your credibility is going to go out the window. In other words, not only are you seen as an ineffective leader, but you'll also be seen someone who really doesn't know how to handle the power or authority that they have. And that doesn't lead to good things. So coercion and manipulation, these are not great and really should not be used unless your back is to a wall. And if your back is to a wall, there are other ways out of it than coercing people or manipulating them. Sometimes what happens when we feel we don't have any option but to threaten somebody, and by threaten I mean, we could threaten people with loss of pay, loss of promotion, loss of jobs, whatever. It's there. People feel they need to do it because they're just not doing what they're being asked. But you see, there is a conversation that could be had to open it up and say, why aren't people doing this? But sometimes people can be afraid to open up that conversation because they're going to find out that there are huge issues in the organization that are not being addressed. And the change initiative that you're involved with is a priority, but there's so many other things intertwined with it that it just gets messy. So the short-term solution can sometimes be a do it or else kind of attitude. If it were me, I'd really bring it back to the top four. Education and participation, facilitation, certainly the top three. Negotiation happens when we're encountering resistance, but people may tell you, okay, we're going to do this if you do this over here for us. Sometimes, it's a good little compromise and it works. But you got to be sure that if you're going to start using negotiation techniques, that it is going to lead to a longer term commitment. So that's it for resistance. We could go on and on about some of these things, but this hopefully will give you a foundation and open your eyes and perhaps your awareness to some things that you may have encountered already and wondered what that was all about. So All the best with your change effort, and be aware that a lot of resistance can be prevented with some great proactive planning and leadership.